If you clicked on this podcast, it is because you are concerned about the educational system here in our country. And I wish I could tell you that you had nothing to worry about, but actually you should be terrified. And that's what we're talking about today on Redeeming Truth. Welcome to the Redeeming Truth podcast. My name is Jon. I'm one of the pastors at Redeemer Bible Church, and I'm here with my good friend, Dr. James Lindsay. It's been a blessing to speak at a couple conferences with Dr. Lindsay. It has been incredible to see the way that he has been on the forefront, the tip of the spear, in fighting against the craziness that is happening in our culture. And so, Dr. Lindsay, thank you for being on our podcast today.
Yeah, it's been too long in the coming, so I'm glad we're finally making it happen.
I agree. Like I was just saying, it was 3.5 years ago I tried to get you on our podcast. And so I'm glad that it is finally happening now. And it is for an incredibly important topic. Education is a massive topic. Every parent has to struggle with education. They have to think about their children's education. They have to weigh things like homeschool and private school and public school. There's so much contention. There's so much stress that goes into these kinds of things, whereas it used to just be like I could just send my kid to school and it was no big deal. Those days seem to be gone now, and you've written 2 books on this issue. One of them is The Marxification of Education, right here, and then the other one is the queering of education, which is a book that I got to read beforehand, which I was honored to do and give an endorsement of. So when it comes to this issue of education, James, why did you jump into this and say, I really need to focus on this?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit funny. I didn't intend to focus on it when I got started in education. I realized it needed to be done. I realized that the thing that we call woke today, I realized the crucible in which that was forged. You know, Jordan Peterson had referred to it as postmodern neo-Marxism, and allegedly postmodernism and neo-Marxism don't really mix. So how in the world did they end up in this kind of emulsion of postmodern methods attached to neo-Marxist critique? And the answer, it turns out, I stumbled upon was within education, colleges of education in particular, which are, they were very to purpose. They were trying to figure out, how do we bring this information to children, and how do we make them think in this critical way? How do we relax their belief in the truth on the postmodern side? And being an educational field, it doesn't have to be pure to any particular philosophical school. It could pick up pieces and mix them together as it needed in order to achieve the objective of teaching children. And so when we add in that second element, that this is geared toward children, and that Marxists who had been moving into education are quite explicit in their own words, is that they intend to disrupt the reproduction of society by changing the minds of children through the schools and through other cultural institutions that influence children, like entertainment and even faith and family. I realized nobody's talking about education, and somebody needs to. And so I said at the time, and I guess this would have been, over 2 years ago, I said I was going to, pardon me for the nerdy analogy, but it's really what I said. I said that I wanted to do a flyby, like one of those space probes that doesn't go in orbit around a planet, but flies by, takes pictures, and keeps going. And then I thought I was going to do like this kind of high-speed flyby, like the probe did of Pluto, and take these great pictures, and then go off to do whatever the next thing is. But what I didn't realize is that the gravity, in kind of all senses, education is such a huge field. It's such an important field. It's such a grave field to see contaminated, kind of pulled me in, and I sort of got stuck there for much longer than I intended. So the intention was, in Cynical Theories, the book that I published in 2020, I touched on a variety of topics, critical race theory among them, queer theory, post-colonial theory, all of which are relevant today, some other things as well, but we didn't talk about education. And so I wanted to correct that and fill that gap. And I thought it was going to be, a handful of podcasts, maybe 10 or so episodes covering the basics, and I would just equip some parents and some teachers to be able to kind of run with the ball. And it turns out that's not at all what happened. I got pulled in, and I'm glad that I did, because it's such an important issue and it's such a complicated issue, and it's literally the issue that I think matters. It's right up there in the very top of what matters in the issues, because if they get the children, it doesn't matter what else we do. And if they fail to get the children, it may not matter what else they do achieve. So it seems to be a very important issue. So that's why I'm glad to have focused on it as much as I have.
So in brief summary, what has happened to education? We can see that it is crazy. If anybody is on social media and sees things like libs of TikTok, they see it over and over again. They can see it on their news feed that there is something wrong, something has changed. And so what happened?
Well, what happened is that activists found a way in, and they're not going to leave that opportunity alone. The opportunity to get in front of children, which are a very soft and impressionable audience, a captive audience. The activists who want to change the way society thinks about all issues are not going to leave alone the opportunity to get into schools. The thing is that the safeguards that we had that prevented them from being able to get into the schools before were all lowered systematically and allowed them in. And it's actually, like I mentioned earlier, there's this concept in Marxist theory that's called the theory of social production, or theory of social reproduction, really. The idea with that is that the schools and other social institutions or cultural institutions, actually their belief is brainwash the next generation to accept the terms of the existing society rather than to be radicals. And they have known all along that has to be disrupted. The papers and the books that were written in the 1960s and 1970s by Marxists who were looking to get into education, Marxist critiques of education, are very clear that the problem of social reproduction has to be addressed. And we have to find an off-ramp, or they have to find an off-ramp for the next generation of kids. And then even more recent articles are very clear. There's an article that we cite kind of extensively in The Queering of the American Child that is by Kevin Kumashiro, where the title of his paper one of his papers that we cite repeatedly is called Against Repetition. So it's against using children to get out of the repetition generation to generation of society. And so what happened is the long march through the institutions, essentially. The project in the 1970s was very unsuccessful. Radical educators were rebuffed in the classrooms by their principals. They were rebuffed in the graduate schools, the colleges of education, by their professors. We had a very genuinely conservative notion of the sacred role of education in educating the next generation, to working with children. And they systematically started to attack that. There is a man by the name of Henry Giroux. He's a communist. He's one of the most probably influential education theorists who has ever lived. He's still alive. He's a complete radical. And he was attempting to do this very unsuccessfully in the late 1970s, going into the 1980s, and running into a lot of roadblocks. And he had an idea, and it's well documented in his own works and in kind of historical, works about how education got changed. He's very clear that his goal was to get as many radicals, Marxists, tenured as faculty of education in colleges of education across North America as he could. And from the late 1970s through the middle of the 1980s, he achieved getting at least 100 of them. And he had a professor that he believed in, this Paulo Freire, who is the Brazilian Marxist who's at the heart of the Marxification of education. That book is to expose Paulo Freire. And his goal was to make it so that when Paulo Freire's work came back to prominence in the mid-1980s, that colleges of education would take it up. This became a movement called critical pedagogy, and historians of Marxist education theory, like Isaac Gottesman, tell us that by 1992, the colleges of education were completely captured. Once you have the colleges of education, you have the pipeline for all of the pieces. You have the method of producing teachers, you have the method of producing administrators, you have the method of producing licensure and accreditation, all in your hand. And you also have the ability to increasingly skew the makeup of colleges of education and the curriculum of colleges of education. So you have to think of it as a generational project. They got 100 in, 100 got 100 more, 100, those 200 got 200 more. And by just a few years later, the colleges of education had been completely seized. In other words, to paraphrase Marx, the means of educational production had been seized by these radicals who were using not old Marxist critique that could never find its way in. They were using this new thing, which is education for liberation, which became called critical pedagogy, that came from Paulo Freire's method that I worked to expose in Marxification of education. So how do we get to the point that we see what we see today? Let that engine run for 30 years and see what happens. Radical teachers bring in more radical teachers. They approve radical papers. They don't approve non-radicals for positions or for academic paperwork. And so one thing leads to another over the course of a generation, and you start raising all educators to lean this way and then eventually to not know any other way. You've now hijacked the educational system, and 30 years of that, you end up in the situation. I mean, there are other details. There were policy changes that occurred through the last 25 years that are very relevant, but without getting into the details of those, just this machine itself is a self-perpetuating machine in that direction once they got their foot in the door, and Henry Giroux really made that happen.
And so once that happens in the schools of education, still the lower schools, like elementary schools, they're still not touched by that. And so, and then there's government, there's other checks, there's other balances that should have come in and checked that a little bit. And so what happened in those areas so that the people who are graduating from these schools then are wait a minute, you don't follow any of these guidelines. You don't follow any of the things that we've been doing for all these years. I'm not going to hire you. What happened there?
Well, that's the other side of that story. For the last 25 years, really since the George W. Bush administration, we've seen a number of policy shifts that have facilitated this. And it's the same thing. You had radicals making their way into the departments of education at the state level and at the level of the federal government that were pushing for these policy changes. So the first of these is very famously what George W. Bush pushed, which was a accountability measurement, which was no child left behind. And of course, a lot of people, even at the time, I remember people joking, it should be called No Child Gets Ahead. But what this was is it was an attempt to say we have a lot of schools that are not making they're not making the grade. They're not adequate. And so what do we do to solve that problem? Well, let's create a set of accountability measurements and start measuring them. Well, the rule of thumb is that if you have a measurement that is tied to funding, and you have radicals that are in the vicinity of setting those policies, that those metrics are all going to get gamed. In fact, it's always the case that if you have a metric tied to funding, the path of least resistance is always not to do the right thing, but to get the best score on the measuring tool. And No Child Left Behind had its own problems, but this actually didn't stop there. It advanced. We know that later, under the Obama administration, the first Obama administration, that we had this lurch into Common Core. So Common Core comes in, built off of the apparatus of these accountability measurements, and said, well, we're going to revamp this common curriculum, and that's what we're going to plug into the accountability program. And Common Core, for all of the things that we could criticize it as an educational program, and there are many, it's much more concerning that it was a very codified way to tie funding to doing what the Department of Education wanted. And this was, at this point, Obama's Department of Education, not even George W. Bush's. And so it was staffed and filled more or less completely with left-wing radicals like Linda Darling Hammond and so on. Fast forward to 2015, at the very end of Obama's tenure, and there was a push to put through something that was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is one of these bills that Congress passed that it's unclear if anybody ever read it because it's, a thick book in length. And it includes this idea that now we're going to expand outward from the accountability metrics under Common Core, and we're not just going to assess two things. One is the curricular achievement of the students themselves, and the second is the implementation by the teachers. There are the teachers trying to implement it. It became an accountability standard under Common Core. But when ESSA came along, Every Student Succeeds Act, in 2015, it added in that we're now going to add in behavioral metrics, social metrics, non-academic metrics. And if you want to get money, then you're going to have to do this. And so that's when the entire kind of therapeutic apparatus, social emotional learning and so on, made their way into the schools as a way to check those boxes. The schools weren't necessarily all that concerned. They wanted to check boxes, and they had to check boxes to get federal funding. And so you end up with this kind of standard corruption that I think led the schools off in that bad direction. Meanwhile, at the entire time, the pathway of the generational march through the institution was always that if you can capture the colleges of education, then you'll capture the future teachers. And if you capture the next teachers, then you capture the future students. And if you capture the students, then that's how you get the future of your country. And so there was a steady march academically leftward through these captured institutions, again, that produce not just teachers and administrators, but also the criteria for licensure and accreditation of all of our education. So the things that used to prevent the radicals from being able to get into education got turned on their head piece by piece by piece through both accountability measures that were getting manipulated and taken advantage of, but also through the kind of relentless march of activists and activists creating new administrators who change the policies. Let me just quick example. Claudine Gay at Harvard became very visible, and she's president of Harvard. And we all know about the plagiarism and the kind of disastrous hearing in Congress. But one of the many real stories behind Claudine Gay that's less reported on is that she had approximately a dozen academic papers in her academic career. What does that tell you? She's president of Harvard. You can say, oh, well, Harvard standards are very low. That's beside the point. What it tells you is that the activists who are in academic settings are not particularly interested in doing academia. They are very interested in becoming administrators who can control the system. They have a preponderance of bias toward wanting to control the circumstances when these activists get into those circumstances. And so when you get enough of them in, the dynamic's very simple. You get a few in, you agitate for more, you get a few more, now you have enough to make a vote. Maybe quorum barely shows up one day, and you vote somebody into a position of power that they then use to push the entire institution in a particular direction. And again, multiply that by 30 years. It's not like this happened, we woke up in 2019 and education went crazy. This is a 30-year march that was occurring through that pipeline.
And so you have the schools of education, you have the government, you have the public schools beneath that, the colleges, universities beneath those schools of education. All of those get infiltrated. All of those change education into activism. There's one last step in order to get the children, and that's the parents. And so how did education now go from being something that comes alongside parents to actually seeing parents as a problem?
Well, it's actually, there's another step in between, which is the cutting out of parents. And I think many people have made the case very well. I have not forwarded this case by my own research, but I think it fits. That Common Core, a lot of people complained about the weird new math that's very confusing. And that one of the things that I've heard thousands of times is I could no longer help my kids with their math homework. I didn't know how to do it. We went from, the old algorithmic methods of multiplying and dividing to these weird drawings and a whole page and very strange things, this kind of new math. And so there was cutting parents out of the process, the disconnect between parents and children in terms of their educational objectives. And I think Common Core was designed around facilitating that, whether that was intentional, which I actually suspect, or whether that was kind of haphazard by bad design. One of the consequences, regardless of intention, was certainly that parents and their kids were not able to work together on their homework like they used to be. It used to be, Dad, I want you to help me with my math homework. And then Dad shows you the way and you get the answers and everybody kind of comes along. And it turned to, well, Dad, if you help me, I'm going to get the wrong answer. It doesn't matter if we get the right solution to the math equation. I didn't do the method right, and so I can't have you help me. And so you have this cutting out of the parents. And then that turns into a dynamic increasingly of, well, your parents are not likely to be able to help you. And in fact, they'll lead you the wrong way. You have to trust the teacher over the parent. And when you start to inject, again, these more social dynamics in the wake of that, starting again after ESSA in 2015, well, at that point, now you have the social and emotional learning of children, the values learning of children, in fact, being warped. But it's not just that. It's not just this kind of progression of cutting the parents out and then saying the parents are the wrong source for help, which would have connected, children back to their parents, as has happened since time immemorial in education. There's also a deliberate, and it's very easy to prove that there's a deliberate effort to cut the parents out, because, for example, there's one of the documents that we cite in The Querying of the American Child is we have an entire chapter about this one document. It's called Navigating Parental Resistance. And so there's a deliberate effort by the activists themselves to cut parents out and, in fact, to deceive parents into, as they phrase it, coming to terms with or accepting or finding the radical education more palatable. And so there's this very deliberate and concerted effort. That is a policy document called Navigating Parental Resistance for how you're going to be able to do the radical education behind parents' back. Well, the first step was to cut them out mostly through these strange new methodologies, and the second step would be to take advantage of that environment to get the parents to be disconnected from what's really happening and deceive them about what's really happening, to get them to come, the phrasing exactly is to get the parents to come to terms with the radical curriculum. For example, one of the tools that they use for that is to couch the radical education, and this comes straight from Paulo Freire, to couch the radical education in learning objectives that the parents will accept. For example, we're going to do a lesson on how to use commas, and here's this very radical document, that they give the children to read, and the job is to find where all the commas go. And the parents maybe object to the radical content of the handful of paragraphs or the page that they give them, which is a very common thing to do. And then they have a teacher-parent meeting, and the teacher says, well, the objective is we just have to have content. It doesn't matter what the content is, and the objective is to get them to use commas accurately. And so the parents are meant to go away thinking, okay, well, they're learning commas and the content itself is irrelevant to the comma lesson, and they move on. Or another one is that they give as an example is these children are assigned to go read very radical literature and create their own math problems based on, say, environmentalism or sexual politics or race politics or whatever. And then they literally phrase that in terms of what they call problem solving. So they tell the parents, well, we're just working on problem solving. And parents are meant to be befuddled by this and to be low engagement and think, well, it's really about problem solving. And they don't really mention too explicitly that what they mean by problem solving isn't learning to solve problems in an academic sense. It's solving society's problems from a radical Marxist lens. And so there's a very deliberate attempt there that, like I said, meshes exactly in with the Paulo Freire's methods of critical pedagogy. And just to touch on that, and maybe we should talk about it in more depth afterwards, Paulo Freire's method is to use academic material, in his phrasing, as a mediator to political knowledge. In other words, as an excuse to have political and radicalizing conversations with children. So the math lesson is given, but the point of the math lesson isn't math. The point of the math lesson is to raise a radical topic and have a conversation about it with your children. And the hard part is that the curriculum, hard part for parents, is that the curriculum can look completely benign or completely standard. But the point is that the teachers are being trained to use those various problems or circumstances as a launching point to have a radical political conversation with the kids in the classroom that unless you're watching, you'll never see. You'll never know that that's what they're doing.
So when it comes to what we've been describing, what you've been describing, you call it in your book the theft of education. And so is there any other part of this that we haven't talked about that has led to this theft of education?
No, that's pretty much the picture. There's the part where they've stolen the purpose of education. It's no longer to teach people the skills and ideas that they need to become functional adults in their society. That's instead to radicalize them. So they've stolen the purpose of education. They've stolen the mechanism of education. The academic material becomes not a lesson to practice learning the academic content itself, but as a mediator to a political conversation. And they've stolen the ends of education, where the ends of education should have been to plug you into the society as a informed, thinking, and possibly, depending on your views of education, virtuous adult. And they've hijacked that and turned it again into the end of education is to make you a radical to overthrow society. So the theft of education refers to those three things. And like I said, the most insidious of them is really the idea that the mechanism of education should be to use the curriculum as an excuse to do politicizing or radicalizing conversations with the students. And that, I think, is the worst part of it. There's a more interesting part, which is the stealing of the purpose of education itself, in that I don't think it's as insidious, but it's actually reflective of the radical mindset or the Marxist mindset, which is that they literally believe, because of their social production hypothesis, that everything that happens in education or in family or in church or anywhere else is literally brainwashing. And so it's their job to brainwash the children differently. It's all brainwashing anyway, so we need to make sure that they get brainwashed the right way. And that's their justification for trying to break the reproduction hypothesis or trying to break repetition, as Kevin Kumashiro phrased it. The purpose is to redirect education into a radicalizing endeavor. Like I said, and the mechanism is the insidious bit, because they transform the academic lesson into a political conversation. And that, in my opinion, and that's what I made the point about, is that it steals education from the children who are robbed. And we see the evidence of this, and it steals education from society that depends on educated citizens coming out of the schools on the other end. And so as the evidence of them being robbed is all over, we see these reports. I see them on social media almost every week at least. Such and such school, 0 kids can read at grade level, 0 kids can do mathematics at grade level or whatever, but sure as shine, they know how to go do activism, which is the exact result that you would expect if their academic lessons are being used as an excuse to do radicalizing politics instead of actually finishing, say, the math lesson or reading lesson or history lesson.
So I want to be practical for parents now. And so let's say I know your children are older now, but let's say you have an 8-year-old and you know everything you know, and you take them into their school. What are things that you would notice that would tell you this school has been radicalized?
The most visible outward signs are going to be the big displays that they put up everywhere with, radical iconography, the fist, the raised power fist, of course, whether that's racial, whether that's sexual, the various pride and related flags. These all indicate that they've bought into the so-called value of inclusion. A little bit more granularly, if their documentation talks a lot about inclusion and belonging and maybe even self-esteem, if it uses the word transformation in particular, I'm going to be very alarmed, and I would think twice, honestly, about enrolling my child in such a school or keeping them in it. I would definitely be having conversations with the administration that would be very uncomfortable for all involved, I think. So the visible outward signs are the symbols that we've come to associate with woke. Is there a ton of stuff about, kind of climate change looking political views? The alarmism, is there, again, the queer flags and the kind of race politics and raised fist iconography? If that's all there, immediately I'm very concerned. If the school's values and mission statement talk about belonging, they talk about social and emotional development. I don't want my school, frankly, to teach my children social and emotional development. I feel like that is a realm reserved to the parents. I don't need the state. I mean, I know, and their argument works this way, that it always is happening, that you do want men and women of character in the schools who, when your kid acts up at school, can give them some character correction or development or whatever. We do want that, but we want the parents to be involved, and we don't want the schools in the driver's seat of character development and values development. So those are the kinds of biggest red flags. And like I said, the words inclusion, transform, belonging, these are red flag words at this point that they are going to have a very hard time getting away from. And I think parents need to be much more familiar that those words signify danger, just like those icons, radical icons like a raised fist, signify danger.
So they're the obvious ones, like you said, the flags, the raised fists, the Black Lives Matter, things of those nature, going into a classroom, stepping onto the school. But there's also, like you said, there are some terminology, but they keep changing the names of things. And so let's say it's a more subtle school. Maybe they're in the South and they don't want to come out as radical as maybe they would if they were in Portland or in Massachusetts. And so they want to be more subtle about it. They're not going to pull it back, but they just don't want to be that overt about it. What would then be some things that parents should be looking for?
Again, I'm going to harp on those specific words like inclusion and belonging, very definitely transformative education. I mean, as somebody that's sitting in a church right now, you know that's a religious word. That's a word you should be very concerned about. That's not the school's job to be doing transformative anything with your children. This to teach them the basics. So those are again going to be the biggest red flags. It's that language. And you say they change the words a lot, and that's true. But parents at this point, honestly, I know people are busy, but there's getting to be very little excuse left a few years into this being kind of everywhere all the time and in your kid's face and in your face. You should be developing a sense of that word that I just saw doesn't feel right. So if they call it critical race theory and you know that's a bad word, well, you catch on to it. If they call it, on the other hand, culturally relevant teaching, all of these things you never heard of 3 years ago or 5 years ago, when you see this terminology, there should be red flags going up. If it's some term that you didn't effectively kind of grow up with, if it's not a term that's kind of general to the population that we've all kind of recognized, it's probably a specific academic term. And when you recognize that this specific academic language is all captured language, as I phrase it, I say every woke term conceals an agenda. And so when you see this kind of academic or buzzword flavored language in some new program, and there's going to be a new thing this and a new thing that, immediately you should start to be suspicious that you don't really want your children exposed to it, because it probably came from a radical laboratory on some college campus and is probably infused with radical intention. And
so in everything we've talked about, the Marxification of education, in the midst of all of this, there's also the queering of the American child, the other book that you are a part of when it comes to education. And so what does the queering of the American child have to do with the Marxification of education?
So think of the Marxification of education, which we've been discussing, as a vehicle. And what's inside the vehicle? Well, we know that critical race theory was been inside the vehicle. Yeah. We know that some of this climate change, environmental sustainability stuff is inside the vehicle. Well, it turns out queer theory, under the brand name again of inclusion, is inside the vehicle too. And so what I mean is that the critical pedagogy, which is what I've called the Marxification of education, is a tool by which they can deliver queer theory to your children, or critical race theory, or the others. Queer theory is a very specific and very damaging ideology. However, it's a very specific ideology. It primarily is focused. It started out as what they called a new radical politics of sex. So it's focused primarily on sex, gender, and sexuality in all the ways that we've unfortunately become familiar with now in the last few years. That gender, for certain, is socially constructed. It's malleable. You may not be the gender that reflects the biological sex that you have underneath you. That sex itself is possibly malleable and downstream from social construction. That sexuality is kind of an open-ended smorgasbord, and you're supposed to kind of do this introspection and discover who you really are on the inside. And again, I've brought this up before, and I'm going to bring this up again now. That's ultimately a religious question. Yeah. The deep ontological questions about who you are and what your relationship to the world are, and then the teleological questions about what you're supposed to do with who you are, what your purpose in life would be. Those are fundamentally deep religious questions, and they are totally infused, whether it's through queer theory or critical pedagogy. Actually, if I can kind of exit ramp from queer theory for a moment, I want to be very clear who Paulo Freire was, who developed the critical pedagogy that we've been discussing so far. he was a liberation theologian, and that means that he was a Marxist pretending to be a Catholic, and that they were expressing their Marxism through Catholic religious dogma. And that is absolutely clear. He calls his method of education, particularly in religious education, Paulo Freire called it developing a prophetic education, or a prophetic church even, which of course is woke. He describes that the process of awakening to what he calls a critical consciousness through this education or religious practice, either one, because he sees them as indistinct from one another, is actually the process of going through your own individual personal Easter to die and be reborn on the side of the oppressed. And that's, again, this is not kind of tangentially religious. This is explicitly religious education, pretending not to be by hiding itself in a math lesson. And that was what Paulo Freire actually invented, and his goal was to teach liberation theology kind of the 1960s and 70s and 80s variety, which has now adopted these other kind of radical politics of identity, particularly in North America, which would be the critical race theory, and which is the radical politics of race, or Marxist politics of race, and then the queer theory, which is sex, gender, and sexuality. And then we can go into the whole pantheon, national origin, ethnicity, fat status, body status, ability status, the whole thing. Those things are the pieces that got plugged into the apparatus underneath of what in the literature is formally called a critical constructivist epistemology that informs a critical pedagogy. Not that we have to unpack those terms, but that's the way that they're thinking about these things. So this is explicitly religious education. And I think queer theory, and in the book we're very explicit, actually is the doctrine of a sex-based religious cult that targets children and has surprisingly little to do with gay people.
I said this in church 2 weekends ago, that Marxism, neo-Marxism, is a religious movement disguised as a political movement, that it's theology and morality disguised as education, disguised as politics, and in many ways disguised in order to keep Christians from speaking about it, because we're not supposed to talk about politics. Just preach the gospel. Don't worry about all these other theological issues going on in the culture. And you've made that very clear in the things that you've taught, especially in the Theology of Marxism conference that we had at the church and Mere Simulacrity conference. You showed that all of this is actually incredibly religious education.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the bottom. Is what people have to understand is when you go to the school and you see the flag on the wall, on the cork board or whatever, or you see the pinned up to a teacher's room, or BLM flag, the pride flags, the fist, whatever it happens to be, any of these kind of radical things, or you see this, blah, 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 boilerplate about inclusion and belonging and all these new values. And in fact, they are talking about values education in kind of a lot of the documentation explicitly, that what the values that they're thinking of happen to be are this, I'll use the C word again, cult religion.
Yes.
I don't think it's a valid religion. In fact, I don't even believe at this point, I came to your church and spread misinformation and disinformation, I guess. I don't even think of it as a theology any longer. I think the correct word is a theosophy, which is a technical distinction. Theology is good enough for a lay audience, but theosophy is a very particular view about the spiritual nature of reality. And in fact, it fundamentally believes that it is up to mankind to seize the means of controlling or producing or directing the spiritual evolution of society and mankind. And that is exactly what Marxism offers, and downstream from that, that's what queer theory offers as well, is this idea that there's, you can secretly know a Gnostic position of belief who you really are outside of the conditioning, the social conditioning of society that brainwashes everybody into thinking, oh, well, I'm a boy, so I have to act like a boy and grow to be a man. They think that's brainwashing, rather than, actual A, fact, and B, character development. And so they believe that you can have a secret knowledge of who you really are that's apart from all of that, and that you can bring that into being, and then bring it into being specifically by trying to make other people, as the phrasing goes, affirm it, or celebrate it, or include it, or make it belong, even when what they're asking to have belong is evil or sin or self-centeredness or entitlement or some other destructive phenomenon, or sometimes something much worse.
Yeah, this is the old Gnostic heresy that was attacked and destroyed by the early church, reborn, revived, and mixed with the writings of people that make it sound philosophical, make it sound incredibly esoteric and educated. But really, at the end of the day, it's the same Gnostic heresies from 2,000 years ago.
And it's actually like, is James speculating? Has he hoodwinked John? Or are we crazy? Well, it's actually very easy to make the case that, in fact, no, we're not speculating. As a matter of fact, I keep mentioning Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was unable to stop writing books. He wrote 20-something of them, I think. And they're all kind of similarly titled. They're all extremely tedious and say kind of the same thing over and over again, which is usually a telltale sign you're working with a cult. It doesn't have a ton of deep knowledge or reflection of reality. It has a message that it's repeating ad nauseum. But more importantly, the first thing is, in the kind of landmark work that brought Paulo Freire's information to the American audience, which is not his magnum opus. His magnum opus was called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It was published in 1970. This book that I'm talking about is called The Politics of Education. This is the one where he talks about having to go through a personal experiential Easter to die and be reborn on the side of the oppressed, and where he makes quite explicit that education and religion are effectively the same project. In that book, he calls what you're developing through his educational method, and I quote, a gnosiological attitude. That's G-N-O, whatever all the other letters are. So he's talking about gnosis explicitly. And you say, well, James, that's a little bit of a stretch. Gnosiological attitude, maybe he's just using a flourish. Well, he's got another book called The Politics of Freedom that he published in 2000. And at 7 different times in that book, he says that the method of education he recommends, and he says it in black and white, is, and I quote, the Gnostic cycle. So he's extremely open and explicit that what he's peddling is, in fact, a reconfiguration of the old Gnostic heresies. I personally, this is a little sophisticated, I personally call this sociological Gnosticism, or sometimes social Gnosticism. My belief is that the philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, who were also esotericists, people like Hegel very famously, but also Marx later, and we could add Schelling and Schiller and several as Stephen Hicks calls them, bad Germans and more bad Germans. Several of these people were not only explicitly theosophical in their approach, following people like Jakob Boehme for their inspiration, who was an outright occultist, but they also talk about the development of what I think that they achieved is that they talk about the development of spirit as a social phenomenon. So rather than the spiritual world being somehow transcendent or separate from the material world, as most Christians tend to believe, and not to get complicated about those details, not to be fully dualistic like the old Gnostics of yore, but they believe that rather than this kind of transcendent spiritual realm, there is what's transcendent is their social interactions. The social world itself, whether, again, I didn't mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France. It's not just bad Germans. There's a bad Frenchman, too. These guys all believe that society itself, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's most famous remark probably is, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. And the chains he was discussing were the social contract, the expectations to live up to particular behaviors. His goal was to figure out how to live as free as the savage, but with the benefits of the city. And so he had this kind of peculiar view that society itself is constraining us from being who we really are. And that's the same concept as the ancient Gnostic heresy, but it was before that there's an evil demon called the Demiurge who's posing as God, who has now imprisoned us in the material world. Here it's that we can't be our true selves because whatever upper class of society that sets the rules, the bourgeoisie as Marx had it, is now imprisoning us in a society where we don't get to be who we really are because of social demands and social constraints put upon our lives and existence. So they were able to take the Gnostic heresy and reformulate it in terms of social control and as Marx phrased it eventually, intrinsically class conflict between the classes that were constructed by the social relations of his society, or of our society in general. And the heresy is just there exactly like it would have been when Irenaeus was casting down Valentinius and Seth and the Manichaeans, 2,000 almost years ago, I guess 1,900 years ago or thereabouts. Yeah. It's exactly the same thing, but now it's the German word for it is the Geist, the Spirit. Rather than the Holy Spirit, it's the spirit of society. It's the spirit of humanity as a whole in the world, the Weltgeist, the world spirit, that's moving throughout all of us and kind of between us and among us and inspiring us to great action or constraining us to not know who we truly are. And so it's the same thing. It's just it's happening in with society in the position of the spiritual.
And so in my mind, as I try to summarize it, it's the difference between a bottom-up mentality that the lie of the serpent, you will be like God, bottom-up, moving your way towards God, versus Christianity, which is top-down, which is God comes to us, where God rescues us. Instead of us trying to become gods, God comes to us, becomes one of us to rescue us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Christianity is exactly the other way. It is a perfect inversion of this myth. Their idea is that it is our objective to realize our true divine nature and to awaken that and to manifest that and to effectively force other people to agree to it in order to make it seem real. It's kind of the peculiar way people like Hegel use the word actual in substitute for reality. Meanwhile, like you said, the idea with Christianity is that the transformative potential is actually not in man at all. It's in God, who came as Christ, and you all know the story better than I do, and that it's still located there. It's you deciding as a personal individual. In fact, individualism is intrinsic to Christianity. Yep, there's no group salvation. Yep. It is whether you have done made the relationship and accepted what you've accepted or have not. And so rather than it being this idea that, well, we have to get the entire society right because society constrains who man is and conditions who man is, so we have to force a change in society so that we can all advance spiritually. Your spiritual question now is all located in the singular figure of Christ and the singular moment of the resurrection, and your individual acceptance or rejection of that particular belief or fact or truth, however we wish to phrase it for the moment. And so this is a complete inversion in both regards. It's intrinsically collectivist, and it's intrinsic because it has to control the social environment, but it's also us. It's in fact, it's not quite right, John, to say that we're elevating ourselves to become God. It's in fact the belief in the Gnostic system all the way through is that we're already God. We just are unable to realize it because we've been alienated and estranged from that by the action of, say, the evil demon Demiurge, the serpent in the garden, or whatever it happens to be. We've been alienated from our true selves, which is that we're already God. To get very technical in the kind of transformative sense, whether Hegel imported the Trinity fully, the Christian Trinity fully to this. It's in fact that we are unknowingly already the third person of the Godhead, and it's the way that we work together one to another that creates the equivalent of the Holy Spirit. So our social environment becomes the equivalent of the Holy Spirit, and then our goal is to recognize in ourselves not just that we are the third person of the Godhead, but that through our own sacrifice of our own kind of mortal wishes or whatever, or our separation or individualism one from another, that we in fact can die to ourselves and be reborn as the second person of the Godhead. So it's not just that the idea is that we start off as the third person of the Godhead and we become our own Christ. And then that's what the New Age cults refer to as so-called Christ consciousness. Okay. And when we attain that, then we have the capacity then to take our full step back into the oneness of being with God and achieve our actual salvation without the alienation and estrangement. So it's not even that we're necessarily elevating ourselves, it's that we're supposed to realize that we're already that. And then there's this process of renouncing the expectations of the existing world to fulfill who we already are, which is that we're already the deity.
It's incredible to hear you say that, knowing a book like 1 John chapter 4 talking about the spirit of the Antichrist already being here, the Antichrist being not just a person in the future, as the Bible talks about, but a replacement for Christ. That's what the preposition means in Greek. It's not just an opposition to, but replacement of. And so to hear Gnosticism described and then pulled in by people like Hegel and Marx and Freire, like you're talking about, putting that all together and realizing, like you said, it is a complete inversion of Christianity. It's incredible to hear that, knowing what I know about the Bible teaches about what you called it, the spirit of the age or the spirit of the world. Here you have the Bible going, that is what's going to be happening in the world. There's always going to be this inversion of Christianity that's going on.
Well, it's very explicit, actually, in Marx, once you kind of have the ability to read through kind of his very angry and coded language. The theory of communism is that there will be an awakening, we should say a religious or cult awakening of the proletariat. The proletariat will realize that they are a class, and in fact what they are, though, is a mover of history. They are the other piece opposite the bourgeoisie of the class conflict mechanism by which history moves. And he says that the goal is to seize the means of production. So now you go from awakening to seizing the means of production of what? Of not just economics, but society itself. In other words, you realize yourself to be creative. You're creative, and we could say with a capital C. You realize yourself, in fact, to be, you rediscover your true nature, which for Marx is that we're all what he called a species being or a social being. We live for the entire species. So you reawaken as a socialist. That's your Gnostic consciousness. And you have socialist consciousness, and then you use that to seize the means of production. So you become creator of society and man downstream from society. And when you have reached that point and you're creative, the point is, everybody is supposed to be brought, say, by the powers of the Soviet state to have the right Soviet or communist belief. And when everybody's properly awakened, what is the claim in communism? It's not that we're going to have this tyrannical Soviet Union forever. It's in fact that the state, when it reaches its zenith of power, will wither away and will enter into a perfect stateless, classless society that sounds very much like the kingdom of God that we've built for ourselves. And so the state withering away, the state then becomes the avatar of the will of man, who has realized himself to be the third person of the Godhead as his own creator. And then the state sacrifices itself in order that man might be free. Then we enter back into as the ancient language would go for the Gnostics, they enter into the pleroma of God. We enter into the plenitude, which is to say fullness, heaven manifested in the universe, with us as our own creator and our own vehicle to return us to who we always were, which is our own creator. So it's very, very clear when you understand what the Marxist theory is, that it's a reconceptualization of the entire Gnostic enterprise, where the bourgeoisie now becomes the demiurge, the demon that controls everybody and everything in the world and imprisons people in their own experience, alienates them from who they truly are, so they can't know that they're truly already a creative being that is the third person of the divine Trinity, that then incorporates itself, seizes power, becomes creative, uses its power to redeem the world, at which point it sacrifices itself. That's the state sacrificing itself, incorporating and then sacrificing itself. So it's the power of God as people is made flesh in the state and then sacrifices itself so that we might enter into the kingdom and have not necessarily everlasting life, but perfect life. And that's literally the communist dream. So it's very easy to connect these things very clearly to see what we're dealing with. And I mean, the proposition I offered there at your church when I think it was in the Theology of Marxism conference we did, was explicitly that the reason that we've dealt with the calamity of Marxism, the millions, hundreds of millions of unnecessarily killed and tortured people, and the destitution and the devastation that it causes, is because we are not identifying it for what it is, which is a cult religion, as opposed to, it's literally a cult, and we're trying to dance around it like it's some kind of a social theory or an economic program when it's absolutely not that.
And this is not a tangent or a side issue, because this is the issue in queer theory. This is what's happened. This is what they're trying to awaken in a person who is buying into queer theory, correct?
Yeah, well, if you you have your dead name, the name that your parents gave you. You have your old life. You die to that. You're reborn as perhaps a trans person or a non-binary or in some way a queer activist. And I'll go through the definition of queer momentarily, because there's no such thing as a queer person. There are only queer activists. It's very important to understand that. And so you have this awakened consciousness where you are now literally self-creative, and that's to be made real by you getting other people to buy into the story and affirm the lie that you're now living. And it is very explicitly, very visibly a death and rebirth program that then tries to move the entire spirit of the age so that we die to the idea of anybody actually being normal. Normal is the antithesis of queer. And so how do we get this? The definition of queer was given by David Halperin. He wrote a book called Saint Foucault, trying to not just lionize, but sanctify or canonize Michel Foucault, the postmodern philosopher, who it stands to mention here was also a pedophile. This is not me being salacious, it's just true, and also quite a kinky sex guy. This guy is the father of queer theory, is unambiguous, and David Halperin tries to canonize him in this book, Saint Foucault, toward a gay hagiography. And in the which, by the way, just tangentially is still recommended on the Gospel Coalition website, which is kind of funny if you know where to look.
It's not funny if you know the Gospel Coalition. It's par for the course, sadly.
I don't recommend the book. I mean, you should know your what we're dealing with. I was going to say your enemy, but you should know what we're dealing with, so you should read it in that capacity. But I wouldn't recommend it as like further learning. At any rate, David Halperin in the middle of this book defines the word queer as it's used in queer theory. And he says in the paragraph, it begins with unlike gay identity. Those are the first three words. They're in gigantic bold print to start the paragraph just by the chance formatting. So it's definitely not the same as being gay. He says being gay is rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice. That is a exact quote. Positive fact means it doesn't mean we know why. We just know that it is true. It is a fact about the world, a positive fact that some people are gay. Whatever the reasons happen to be, fine. And then he says, this paragraph, though, is unlike gay identity, which is rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice. There is nothing to which queer identity necessarily refers. He, in fact, says that it relies on no positive facts and no stable reality, as a matter of fact. And he says that it is defined instead by its position, which is to say its political stance, against the normal and the legitimate. And he says that, in fact, queer is defined as whatever is opposed to the normal and the legitimate. And so you have this same Gnostic architecture. You have certain people who have defined themselves to be normal. They defined the boundaries of society. This is normal not to wear your leather out to the street in front of children. It's normal not to try to be a pervert at work. It's normal not to be a pedophile, these kinds of things. And they have set boundaries, strict boundaries within society that exclude the abnormal or the queer.
Yes.
Who are then politically awakened. So they aren't actually queer, they're just abnormal or deviant. These are all words that Halperin uses, deviant, perverse, and so on. They're not queer until they're awakened to be opposed to the idea of normalcy and legitimacy themselves. In other words, the normal assigned themselves normalcy, use normalcy to alienate the abnormal from themselves and from full participation in the aspects of society, but our true inner nature is that we, in fact, nobody's normal. Everything is all queer. Everybody can be however they want to be. There is no normalcy whatsoever. That's an oppressive fiction that's meant to constrain people. And if we seize the means of production of normalcy and overthrow that, then we can move into what they always describe as a queer horizon, where We don't have any more expectations about how people are going to be, and we're going to be liberated from such expectations, especially with regard to sex, gender, sexuality, but also health status, mental health status, and so on are all covered kind of under the broader queer theory discussion. So it's the same Gnosticism, but what they're doing now is using the vehicle of individuals who are going to go through a personal death and rebirth transformation with their old dead name and their new identity entirely, and they're going to use those as as kind of living saints. And you hear that all the time, that their trans people are sacred is one of the things that they kind of bandy on about quite a lot. You see them referred to as divine beings. Because what they are actually doing is they are living in a way that disrupts the concept of normal itself, so that normal can no longer be grasped onto, and eventually we can enter into a new kingdom of God, which is beyond the queer horizon. This is their language. This is how they think. And it's the exact same program where, rather than economic means of production in the bourgeoisie for Marx, capital, now you have normalcy, which is a form of cultural property created by people who decide to define themselves as normal and exclude everybody else from the benefits.
And I've learned from you that the issue is never the issue. So the issue is never queer or race or gender or education. The issue is always Marxism. It always comes back to that.
It's always to overthrow the existing society. Right. So that's why you saw a huge wave of critical race theory, which didn't go away, but it largely died out in terms of how much energy is behind it. It's still there. It's still happening. But it was a big wave. And then the next big wave was the queer theory thing with the drag queens in front of the children and the whole thing we did for the last 2 years. And then that's kind of lost steam. And so while for any given individual that might be the issue that they care about, that they're latched onto because they've wrapped their sense of self into this, and their sense of salvation from an oppressive world into this, they've now largely moved on to the immigration issue. And so now national origin and ethnicity are going to be vastly more interesting. And that's where the energy is going to go. Because for the people who get caught up in this, each issue might relevantly be the issue. For the people who are actually committed to what's happening to try to transform or tear apart our society, these are just tools. Critical race theory, I used to say, was the lockpick to open the door to our civilization, and they did. And then queer theory was going to come behind it, and it was going to disrupt everything. I should have predicted that the immigration issue would be the next big wave. I did not successfully predict that, but that's going to be the big push that we're dealing with now, and eventually that will lose steam and they'll replace it with another one, because the issue itself is merely a means to an end, and the end is to destroy our society and destroy the people in it so that we enter into a state of dependency and accept their program.
It'll be something like climate or health, or
climate is the gold that they're trying to get to, and it could be health in the in between. I will point out, speaking of that, that idea that, I've lost my train of thought, so I'm trying to remember what I was going to say, because there's something very, very pertinent there. But I started thinking about climate change. I'll just leave it. If it comes back, it comes back. But for the moment, I'll just say that, yes, indeed, the issue is not actually the issue. The issue is to open society and transform it into something. I was going to talk about dependency, into something that they control. With queer theory, the dependency is extremely clear. And this is, I think, people have missed the point. People like Matt Walsh did an excellent job of raising awareness of the what is a woman question, that the queer Marxists are unable to articulate what a woman is in a satisfactory way. We saw Marsha Blackburn catch Ketanji Brown Jackson in her confirmation hearing for Supreme Court with, can you define woman? And she couldn't. And a lot of people have missed the key point here, because we're talking about adults usually, but think about this with children. So Ketanji Brown Jackson says, I can't answer that question because I'm not a biologist, which is to say everybody laughs, blah, blah, blah. We can get into the whole nitty-gritties of it, but that's irrelevant. What she said is, I need an expert to answer a very basic question about reality. And that means I am dependent upon some expert to tell me about very basic facts about reality. So now imagine a 6-year-old. Oh yeah, some boys are girls and some girls are boys and this and that, and everything's up for grabs, and some people are neither and some people are both, and then there's lots of other things. It's all very confusing. And, so-and-so says that she's trans, and so we have to celebrate her, but so-and-so says that he's trans, and he doesn't act like it, so we're going to, not celebrate that yet. This whole thing. They know who's really trans. They know who's not really trans. They know when it counts. They know when it's this. They know what that creates in these children is a sense of dependency. They have to go ask not an adult, but a so-called trusted adult, which is just not their parents necessarily, but they have to go ask somebody who is a relevant expert. They have to ask their teacher. They're not learning to discern reality for themselves and articulate what they discern in reality and understand it on various levels of abstraction versus concrete and come to understand it and have a depth of thinking. They're learning instead that I need a qualified expert to tell me the right answer to extremely basic questions, including of fundamental identity. And that's a dependency state. Well, if everybody is in a grotesquely dependent state where they can't discern reality for themselves, that means the totalitarian state that might want to fill that void can take care of people and make sure that they have the right answers to all their behavioral questions, but also that they behave exactly the way that they should in all circumstances. There's no independence. There's no individual. And as I said before, just from a Christian perspective, since you're at the church, I'll bring it up. If there's no individual, there's no creating that relationship with the Savior. So it's really fundamentally a problem.
Yeah, it creates a substitute Savior. It creates an antichrist that says, I will save you, while creating the problem that put them in the place to begin with.
Exactly.
They create the problem, they create the solution, they create the dependence. It's the same thing with the gender affirming care, quote unquote. Every single word in there should be the opposite, but it's that same idea. By taking them through all of the surgeries, all of the medication, doing all of that, they're creating a dependent class of people, another dependent class of people, dependent on the government, and they've alienated them from everybody, so nobody's going to want to be connected to them in any kind of emotional, relational way, because they've destroyed their entire body. So now they're totally alienated. If they don't kill themselves, they become absolutely dependent on the state that caused and allowed all of this to happen.
Right, and a state that enforces rules. So if you or I decide that we're going to stick with the truth and not affirm a gender delusion or whatever, well, they want the power of the state, and we see this with censorship rules kind of all over on social media, but it's law in many countries. We see it that parents have to affirm these things in many states, California, of course, being kind of most visible, but I think there's 14 of them already that have taken this up, where you have to affirm, and they want the power of the state to force the affirmation of the delusion. And so you have no capacity to resist, because it's not just that they want dependency, that they want the state to enforce that state of dependency. But this is exactly like I mentioned with Marx. It's that you have now awakened to who you think you really are, and you are incorporating that in the state, which is going to enforce, it's going to force everybody to participate in the story, the religious story that you're telling about yourself and who you really are and your relationship to the world. And then when the idea is, when everybody is forced enough to where they've been remade through social reproduction into this queer mold, then no longer will you need the state, and the state can sacrifice itself, and we actually live in a perfectly liberated world where nobody's forced to affirm. We all just do it because it's just what we do. And it's the same exact model, but they want dependency, and then they want to use that dependency as a excuse to cause the state to enforce their beliefs on everybody.
So we have talked about a wide-ranging set of issues and topics. Is there anything we haven't touched on, or things that you've thought at the end of other interviews that you've done, like, I wish they would have brought this up? Anything that is still left unsaid that needs to be said when it comes to these issues?
Well, I want to make it very clear that it's deliberate. I'm not necessarily saying that there's been this grand overarching plan that, was written down in 1951, and then they checked off a box here, and we've got this, so now we go to. I don't think that. I think there's a lot of opportunism with taking advantage of how things have rolled out that's come in with all of it. But the implementation is deliberate. It's not just about the document I spoke about earlier of navigating parental resistance. It proves that. I mentioned this fellow Kevin Kumashiro in the paper Against Repetition. And this is, I think, to be honest with you, of all the things that are in Queering of the American Child, I think it's the most important and shocking and, in a sense, provocative. And it's quoting from Kevin Kumashiro, who explicitly says that the purpose of a critical pedagogy or a queer education, more specifically, is to lead the children into a sense of personal crisis. He says that the purpose of education is to lead children into crisis and then to structure the environment around them so they resolve the crisis productively. And so this is very deliberate. That is, in fact, brainwashing. Those are brainwashing techniques, that you create a sense of crisis that can only be resolved by structuring this environment around them to get the desired resolution. This is what they did in Mao's prisons in China in the 1950s. This is what the struggle sessions did in the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s in China. It's very concerning, and that's reflected also in a UNESCO document that we also discussed. There's a document published by UNESCO a few years ago that's called SEL for SDGs, Social Emotional Learning for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it says that asking children to become activists with self-contradictory demands in the activism causes a lot of anxiety and stress, and in particular cognitive dissonance. It's very difficult for the children to resolve this anxiety and stress. In other words, they enter into a personal crisis, but the tool of social emotional learning is ideal for bringing them through that crisis and into the correct values on the other side of the crisis that will allow them to continue to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is extraordinarily deliberate, and that's kind of the big point. This isn't just happening. It is being made to happen by activists who have infiltrated at every level, from entities at the scale of UNESCO to the Department of Education to the schools themselves. I'm not saying that it's everybody. It's actually probably proportionally a relatively small number of people at each level in each entity. But this agenda is very deliberate, and it knows what it's doing, or thinks at least that it has some noble purpose or even divine right to do things that are otherwise easily recognized as harmful, like intentionally leading children into personal crisis. I understand as a math educator that math occasionally leads children into personal crisis, but the goal isn't to lead them into personal crisis with algebra. The goal is to help them try to achieve the capacity to understand how to manipulate the symbols to solve the algebraic equations and arrive at those solutions and understand what they mean. It's not to cause the math crisis. So the fact that they see education as a deliberate program of pushing people into crisis to structure their resolution of that crisis is alarming. It's, in fact, definitive proof that it's called brainwashing. And in fact, there's a lady, or a pair of people, actually, I don't know if they're ladies, that wrote a book that we also cite in Queering of the American Child, who say that we too often to paraphrase them, they say that we too often shy away from the accusation that we're indoctrinating students. And they say that enough of this, it's time for us to own it. That's exactly what we do. So there's, not only is it deliberate, there's also, at least within some of the activists in education, a very self-aware state that they are doing indoctrination and brainwashing, and that they feel like they have a right to do it. And I just urge parents to understand that it is happening on purpose, but it's happening on purpose because the people pushing it have a religious disposition. I think it's a cult disposition to spread the cult to more people, and that they feel fully entitled to do that. So you're not going to go have a simple conversation with them or go to the State House and get a simple law passed that prevents them from attempting to do this. And so what that means is, for parents, is you're going to have to be very proactive with your kids. You asked me if I had my hypothetical 8-year-old, what I would be doing. The crucial aspect is to have the tightest relationship with your children you can possibly imagine. You should be having dinner regularly at the table with no devices, getting to know each other, asking every day what happened at school, what'd you learn, did they talk about this, did they talk about that? And you have to navigate that as a parent, so which topics you want to bring up and not bring up. And if it comes to it, you have to figure out how to protect them, if that means taking them out of the school, putting them in an alternative, some different school, or whatever it happens to be, or homeschooling even, to protect them from these things. Because the we're dealing with very young and impressionable minds, and the people that have architected these programs of education or miseducation know that, and they're taking advantage of it. But those are literally your children and your grandchildren, and it's very, very serious. And in my opinion, frankly, I think it's criminal.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And there were, right there at the end, that you gave some advice on what to do. Anything else? I mean, it seems like it's a Goliath, and it's not like there's Davids, there's ants trying to throw dust at Goliath. Like, it just seems like it is so big and so formative, or so formidable. But are there ways that you've seen or are seeing where there is hope to be able to attack this?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of happening all over the place. Some states are doing better than others. Florida, for example, is taking steps every day.
Yeah.
It's having some measure of success. You have to realize you'll burn out if you don't understand that this is going to be a generational project for us to recover the schools, which is not, I mean, that's very cold comfort if your children are 9 years old right now.
Yes.
We are not fixing the schools. Let's just level with you before your children graduate. So that's something you're going to have to, no one asked for these times. No one's happy about these times, but that's something you're going to have to navigate because of those are the realities of the times that we have. But there are steps you can take. Speaking up and not being silent. I frequently say very biblically that you have to love the truth with all your mind, all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And the reason I say it is because, and you have to tell the neighbor your truth as you would want your neighbor to tell you the truth. And the reason that you have to do that is because if you don't love the truth, the second it gets hard, you'll fold. You'll say, well, right, my kid, or I don't want to lose my job, or I won't get invited to the Christmas party or whatever, and you'll cave in. But if you love the truth, you'll stand up for the truth, you'll look for the truth, you'll get engaged, you'll proclaim the truth, you'll go out and evangelize in a sense for the truth, but you'll also stand up for other people that are telling the truth. You'll help them tell the truth. You'll help them if they're under fire. You'll stand with them. And it turns out that you can picture ants throwing dust at Goliath, but I pictured Goliath stepping into a hill of fire ants and it not particularly going well for him.
Yes.
And, an alternative David figure taking advantage of that moment to plunk him in the head. Right. And so it's, the ant probably shouldn't underestimate what they can do. Yeah. You also have the tool that is the most powerful tool against what they're trying to do, which is that you as parents actually have your children, and you can nourish, like I already gave that advice about nourishing the relationship. One of the things I recently saw, and I know people may have a fit of joy or rage for me saying this, but one of the things I recently saw is that whether you're particularly religious or not, finding a good, healthy church, which is very important, and going to church as a family every Sunday has a variety, even from a secular perspective, a variety of very beneficial purposes to building that family dynamic. It's an hour without devices where everybody will assume it will be real. We know that some people are very enthusiastic about church, but people have other things. They could have been playing golf Sunday morning. They could have, been doing family vacation. They could have slept in. So you're making yourself do something together as a family that's generally, if you found a good church, it's nourishing, it's community, it's delivering a positive moral and ethical message. It's reminding you of who you are and what your life is supposed to be about. And it's supposed to be very, even from from a completely secular perspective, there are tremendous benefits to going to church as a family. So if you have children, I encourage you to find a good church and take your kids every Sunday as well. I know a good church in Gilbert there that I have attended services of and rather enjoyed. So I would encourage that. But you having your relationships with your children is the biggest. It seems small. It's one kid, or maybe you have 2 or 3 kids. It's just a couple kids, right? Well, it turns out that it all starts there. It all starts with you and your relationship with your kids and your neighbors modeling that relationship. And the next thing you know, you can actually get an entire generation that's got the necessary character to resist what's going on in the next turn of the dynamic. And so maybe it's too much to say we're going to go show up and ban whatever and get it to all stop, but we can protect our kids in the short term. We can help take steps to start reforming or reinventing education so that this isn't a continuing problem. We can identify more clearly how these dynamics work so that politicians and parents and teachers themselves can stand up to it and start making those reformations happen. But if everybody sits on the couch and says, I'm just an ant, like nothing's ever going to happen.
No, I agree. We need 100. We need tens of thousands of Davids who are going to say, I'm not going to let this happen. Not on my watch. I'm going to do something about it. And so thank you for doing that. In many ways, you are leading the anti-Marxist culture war. And I'm very grateful for the way you've done that, the way you've read all of these books and synthesized the information for the rest of us. It is an incredible blessing, not just to the society at large, but to Christians who really care about truth and really care about the things that they're seeing. And so I cannot thank you enough for doing that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I just again, maybe it's a bit funny for me to do this, but, people see this as a daunting, fearful thing. How in the world is David going to take down Goliath? Or how in the world are we going to stop this maybe behemoth? Is this the Antichrist? And, it's very daunting. It's very easy to get very overwhelmed and think there's nothing I can do and just kind of wash out. But I mean, frankly, to be a little bit blunt, I feel like that's a very faithless position. And if I think you should have faith. I think that Jesus is right when he speaks in the Gospels that faith, the size of a grain of mustard, can move a mountain. And as many people know, I'm not religious, and I had my whole angry atheist phase. I used to laugh at that verse and thought it was very silly. I actually think about it quite a lot now, and I think it's rather profound. Having seen people who I consider to have lost faith that this is a thing that we can set to right, and become very frustrated with many of them. And it's, people ask me all the time, how do you keep going? And the answer at the end of the day truly is because I believe that if we keep going, then we can make a difference, which turns out to be the Hebrew's definition of faith.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lindsay. It is always a blessing to interact with you, and today is no different. This was incredibly helpful information that I think a lot of parents will be helped and blessed by. And so thank you for making time to be on the Redeeming Truth podcast today.
Well, it's a privilege to have that opportunity. Thanks, John.
Thank you, my friend. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time for Redeeming Truth. Hey, don't leave yet. If you're part of the 75% of people that watch our content but haven't subscribed, this is your time. Go down and find that little subscribe button and click it. That way you will know every time we come out with more content here from Redeemer Bible Church. Also, if you would like to give to this ministry, this is the only way that this ministry can happen. Make sure to click the link down below to the give button and you can give to the ministry here at Redeemer. And then finally, if you want to know more about what's going on, check out this podcast right here.